used to think about it madly. You want a conversation gladly, and I'm hoping oh so badly you could show me who is Scott Daddy.
Hey, welcome everybody. Today I'm talking with Bless from the Discord community. Bless is someone who toys around with different religious practices and thoughts and whatnot. Kind of has labeled themselves Gnostic in some way, and so I'll just let Bless explain it better. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I I realize how non-committal everything I've said to you is that like the introduction is guess Gnostic in some way. I don't know. Um I also didn't realize is your show just actually about religion? I don't know if I thought about that until the Who is Sky Daddy coming up at the beginning.
Did you hear the intro video come through the Discord?
No, I just saw the text.
Oh yeah.
Um
So
Because
so
I looked at the episodes you've done and saw that it was like, oh wow, I guess a lot of people talk about religion on
Yeah, I need to change the video. So I used to go, the channel name used to be Who is Sky Daddy. And that was like the
here. Gotcha.
TikTok name and all that stuff. But changed it for multiple reasons. One of them being because I don't only want to talk about religion. I do want to expand it to everything like science, politics. So it's
Sure.
kind of that's why the new name was born, but I still the intro song, you'll have to listen to it later. It's pretty fun. But yeah, so
Yeah.
anyway, thank you for coming
Okay.
on. I
Yeah. For sure. I can also actually try and describe myself, um, which is like the other term. I was trying to think of like other terms that would work. I gave you like esoteric Gnostic, and then was thinking about it. I was like, maybe that's misleading. And then I thought of occult Christian because
mm,
that term was really funny to me to think about, and it felt a little less misleading. So I like that one.
okay.
But in general, the idea that sort of like most embodies what I'm doing right now is an idea I encountered called like playful religion is what it was called in this manifesto. I wrote a bunch of weird religious books for show and tell for fun. So I do
Fun, yeah.
have like this book, Religion is Play. It's got design that makes it look like a birthday card from your aunt, but I do think it's pretty good. And it talks a lot about it has a notion of bordering religions, which is the a religion is bordering if it has like a stronger, more exclusive um entitlement, I guess, to meaning making and deciding what should be considered true, what isn't true, and especially if that's like decided higher up versus lower down, or by like a elite clergy or like a average participant. And then so a religion that would not be bordering is one that's a lot more flexible, but experimental, and so in my own as I was raised Catholic by
Oh, I was
parents that were
yeah, sorry.
yeah,
I was actually gonna interrupt and just
yeah,
say I actually like to get kind of your religious upbringing and the process
sure.
that brought you to where you are now. So
Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I was raised Catholic by parents who were pretty lukewarm about religion in general. So uh would go to church like every Sunday, basically until I got my first communion, and then they didn't really care anymore, so I didn't. And I sort of evolved as like a really mathy, sciency, like sort of kid into being a new atheist for a little bit until I learned enough about philosophy to just be like, oh wait, if God is transcendent, we don't know anything about that, or like if God exists or doesn't exist. So that's that. That's the answer to the question. And then I was basically done with it at that point. Um, until at some point, especially around like when the pandemic started, but like before like that, a couple of years ago, I guess, I found myself really struggling to understand the world and like reality and to noticing a limit in my own thinking about like processes that involve like lots of people or like cultural changes like on a very large
Mm.
scale or like long-term processes that span multiple generations. Like I was like, it's hard for me to like observe phenomena and rationalize about them if they are that massive. And I wonder if that's what religion and mythology are for. So that was it was me kind of starting to do a mind act there, just to see like maybe this will work because I do think about my own thinking quite a lot. Um, and so that's when I started to dip back into it. And I also started, I guess, going crazier and crazier during the lockdown and during an extremely bad relationship
Mm.
where so I was having one of the roughest times of my life. And so I was also like trying to lean into religion for that. It was like, okay, I know a lot of people find comfort in this. Like, can
Yeah.
that work for me? And didn't have much success, honestly. I just enjoyed like adopting religious terms and how I started rationalizing or like thinking about cultural phenomena and also enjoying how it freaked people out a little bit to do that because I do like being a troll. Um, but so that was about it. And then that kind of bottomed out into the lowest period of my life where I had a really big mental breakdown where I had to move back in with my parents at an age that I consider it pretty embarrassing to do so because I don't know, end of a relationship, like couldn't look, was just a wreck. Um, and then in a wreck in the middle of nowhere, very rural area where the only people I see are just my parents.
Mm.
Um, so I wasn't in a good state. And so the reason I described myself as like embracing being the protagonist in a Lovecraft story was because the big changes like since then that have all happened fairly recently are because I have found some weird book nobody's ever heard of, read it, and then had a massive like revelation from it. So part of the show and so here we go. I found this like book by like a Jewish philosopher called like the Absolute Collective
Mm.
and managed to hunt it down and found it for like $30 despite like nobody ever talking about it except one of the only times it's mentioned anywhere that I could find was Henry Miller said it was one of his favorite books, uh, which is kind of fascinating. So I read it, and as a person who has read a lot of philosophy and felt like very stuck in, or I guess it might help to say that like I also had found myself in these intervening years to be interested in philosophy and politics, and those as the person I am, I like getting into weirder and weirder forms of things. Um, just as like almost compulsive contrarian and a person who always wants to dig right into like the deepest arcana of something at any time. Um, my politics got, or my philosophy just got extremely postmodern to the
Mm.
point
Yeah.
where I had felt like I had deconstructed just about everything I could think of, and to the point of a crisis where I was like, "What is there?" Right? Like, how do I build something back up now? Um,
Kind of like what
and
Descartes did,
like,
right?
oh, right, yeah, yeah, yeah. Descartes is on the mind, and I did struggle a lot with Descartes and talking to. Oh, this ties in nicely with how I started thinking about religion too. With struggling with like Descartes and in philosophy debates with friends about like getting over like solipsism or
Yeah,
skepticism,
yeah,
right? Of like, how
exactly.
do I know there's a reality?
And if I
And
could just
I actually
interject
wrestled
here
with
for a second, and you know what? I want to say, I do think there's like a delay kind of between us. So we may run into weird moments where we're both kind of trying to talk. Um, I don't know how to make that better. So if anyone knows how to run the software better, please let me know. Um, but yeah,
totally.
so
Yeah.
Descartes, just also like for anyone listening, just so you know, like I don't think all of my audience is like super philosophically minded. And so if we're bringing up certain terms and whatnot, it would be nice to maybe explain what they are. And so
Totally.
Descartes the one who basically brought extreme skepticism into the world. Like, what can I know for
Yeah.
sure? Boiled it all down to, well, I know that if I'm thinking, I have to be something. And so, like, that's the one thing I know. And then, yeah, so I get what you're saying about solipsism, which is basically I
Right.
could be the only existing entity. Everyone else around me is just part of my world or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that and I also dealt with that a little bit myself, where like the solipsism hole and kind of the nihilism hole can really drag you down into it and just be like, well, I can't
Yeah.
know shit, nothing matters, all yada yada, and
Yeah.
it can end up being kind of a spiral. But so
I know that for sure.
yeah,
Yeah.
I wanted to touch on it sounded like you're kind of talking about somewhat of a collective consciousness type idea, uh, where you're into this idea of people sharing certain experiences for whatever reason. And I was raised Mormon, and I'll tell you one thing is they definitely
Oh,
do that. Like they all have that spirit feeling, like that's a collective feeling that they all say they experience. And I really I think that this is a huge part of life, to be honest. Like the way societies works, politics and everything, it's like we're so we're so like wired to want to coagulate and like follow each other and agree on the same things. And
yeah.
so I
Yeah.
thought that was interesting. um and you have anything to say about that before I move on?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I think that is a extremely important thing, and that's sort of like in addition to like myself feeling in dealing with like solipsism and nihilism, like I felt like for the past decade it has been a big fight against nihilism. Like, what is there besides nihilism?
Yeah.
And that is a fight that has only intensified as time goes on, especially in the past few years. Um, because in addition to having like philosophical nihilism, I started to feel like a sort of political nihilism that
Mm,
felt like it came from total impotence, right? Which is just like, how do I do anything? How do I affect a change? And so
yeah.
the reason that I would tie that back to what you're saying about like the community and shared experiences that I would say most people I know seem to feel that way. And that struck me as like, oh, what is there to do to like try and like fix this, right? Because
Right.
for
Honestly,
myself as well as for everyone around me, right? Um, and that is where that it then connects directly to my thought about that. If try to how to like make myself and the people around me hopefully eventually start to feel better is playing around with religion in the hopes
interesting.
of like seeing how that resonates with our minds. But yeah, I do think that like community is vital. I am a very
Yeah.
social, very emotional person, and anything I do, I want to share with those around me. Like
Yeah.
that
Well,
that
and
feels like a core meaning. of like
You know,
right.
I
So
had the
how I got
same.
out of skepticism was just being like, okay, I need a fundamental principle, and mine's going to be like, I want to love everyone, which is
Yeah,
kind of corny, but that is my most core thing there.
it's a good foundation, I think. But what you
Yeah.
said about like feeling, um, basically like you can't do anything about the problems of society. What's a good word for that?
Yeah.
Basically, hopeless or useless to like changing the way society
Or
operates and stuff. And
impotent, right?
yeah, exactly.
Powerless. Yeah,
And I
was how I
that's
was thinking of.
exactly like how I was feeling. And the reason I even started up this Discord and this channel and all that is because I was like, you know what? Something I can add is trying to talk to people, even if we disagree, like being very empathetic to people who I think have shitty, terrible
Yeah,
ideas. Because I'm
yeah,
somewhat of a determinist, and I recognize that people don't really choose their beliefs, and so that level of empathy is goes a long way, I think. But we kind of
yeah.
mentioned politics a little bit, so I'm curious. We don't really have to dive too deep, but first of all, where you kind of fit scientifically, if you accept most of the modern theories, or if you know think the Earth's
Yeah.
flat, and then as well like where you sit
Um, yeah, for science, I do, I, yeah, uh, I live in reality. I'm trying to think of how to word this. Like,
Yeah.
I, if there is an objection I have to like anything scientific, it is part of the general like uh caution I have around everything, where I believe
Right.
that I don't know how to access truth, and if you're learning like a scientific discovery, you have to take it with like the appropriate context and the grain of salt, right? Like just be like if you're I feel like anyone who's researched or like tried to figure out like, okay, how do I fix my diet? Like, what's the right nutrition? You discover if you look at a bunch of different things that anyone can defend literally anything with like
Yeah.
nutrition studies. So there is like an element of caution, but like I believe that like global warming or like climate change is happening. The world's heating up
Yeah.
and is round. Um,
Okay.
and we revolve around the sun.
Well, and real
Uh,
quick, like,
and
because
then
you mentioned
yeah,
that, you know, falling into the hole of skepticism, but I will say I think skepticism is good. It's just when it turns into that
yeah,
extreme like solipsism, that's when it goes bad. So,
yeah. I did read a book I really liked recently called Conspiracist Manifesto that
mm,
like defended conspiracy style thinking just because it's with on the basis that the a lot of things that cause changes in the world, like a lot of the big acting forces are conspiratorial, and like was trying to defend just like not dismissing things as just conspiracy, right? Because it's weird. A lot of the big conspiracies I know of do have like some kernel of truth in them that then
yeah.
spirals into something that becomes unmanageable and off-putting to anyone outside of it. But
I think the problem with conspiracies really is that there's always a way out. Like you can sit there and say, you know, well, this doesn't make sense, or like, you know, NASA's taking pictures of the Earth, right? But there's always a way.
yeah,
Well, it's fake, it's CGI. NASA's lying to us. So even if you like bring facts to the table, there's just always a way out.
yeah, yeah, yeah. That's a really good way to put it. Um, and I think recognizing that there's always a way out is huge. Um, it's hard to talk about, especially when you're having discussions with people who then there's a bunch of good reasons to just dismiss something, and some of them are more obvious than others. Where it's just like, oh, you dismiss an argument because of someone's profile picture versus you dismiss an argument because you're like, oh, well, that disagrees with my news source, which is this it's hosted on Lively. It's a it's a monthly show. He he tells the truth and nobody else does. Um, can be harder to be like, well, how do you know he tells the truth? Or
Right. Yeah.
more to dig into. Um, I forget. Politically, I am also weird. I would say that eh, people would probably regard me as a leftist, and I stopped using that term just because I stopped knowing what it
Yeah.
meant. Is how I would put it. Though I am extremely anarchist, I was describing myself
Mm.
as post Civ until my friend came up with the term post hope, which I liked. So I like the term post hope for politics. It's just like I would like
Mm.
for local communities to really care for each other and in a way that feels like really cornily kumbaya utopian, I guess, now that I
Yeah.
think about it. But like
W-
local community work and just ideally getting as little hung up with politics as far as like politics of like the current world goes, because I think a lot of it is just a sort of culture war spectacle to
Mhm.
prevent us from like actually doing meaningful things. So that
Well,
is
and
a spicy take indeed.
some leftists would say that that's the capitalist conspiracy and capitalist agenda is to keep us, yeah,
Yeah,
basically wedged and working like minimum wage, lots of labor, low profit for ourselves, and little labor, high profit for those running the corporations. So
yeah,
yeah, the culture war, I think, is definitely designed to steer us away from labor movements and like looking into better economic
yeah.
systems.
There is to prove the to drive this point home. There is a there's an essay by Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, that I think is really good about this, called "The System's Neatest Trick," where it is like, oh, you know, with for women's movements, and then you want gender equality in now. We can celebrate that by having like a horrible female CEO, right? So it has like assimilated one thing as an appeasement in a way that effectively changes nothing important about the system.
Mm, yeah.
And I guess what I mean by post hope then is while I agree totally with everything that you just said, I do I think it's like what are you gonna do? I don't see how it happens
Right.
anymore. Like it's impossible for me to see like what avenue of change there is
Yeah.
to cause there to be a different economic system. And that is something I have argued with people a lot about. And
Well,
I
it's
don't know.
happened in other
I think it's
countries.
yeah,
Yeah, so it maybe you're right that there's not a lot of hope for the US, but globally there
yeah,
could be hope in other countries, and maybe eventually they'll lead the charge for what a humane society looks like. Um so I almost put my hope more in like those Nordic countries than our own. Um
yeah.
but yeah, you know
I,
we almost maybe should like schedule a round two and like specifically focus on politics. I think that would be really fun. But I do want to get
yeah,
into like Gnosticism and like what that actually means, and more specifically what you mean
sure.
by it. So I think to start us off here, I think I remember in our chats you saying something about salvation basically coming through this connection with the divine. Either that or I read it when googling Gnosticism. um and so do you resonate with that, basically like that's where salvation comes in?
Sure. But also the idea of what salvation is is non-trivial, I think.
Mm.
Um, there is so to go back to this, which I realized I didn't like elaborate much on, like the Absolute Collective book. Um, like so philosophically, like my own metaphysics at that point, or the way I thought about reality was just absolute like um are you familiar with Spinoza and
That's like
the
my
god of
biggest
Spinoza?
that's my biggest influence for my naturalistic
Yeah.
metaphysics. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So me too, at least for a while. And it still is huge and a very fundamental piece of the way I think about things. But I found that this book created such a good, like, metaphysical argument in the way that I think is the only way that, like, an argument for, like, the existence of something like the divine outside of a Spinoza kind of context would work, which is just, like, it vaguely points at, like, a God-shaped kind of hole,
Mm.
and it's just, like, pointing at it like, "Eh? Eh?" Um,
Mm.
so it is it while I got over skepticism by just being like, "Okay, I assume it as, like, an axiom that, like, there is a reality,
Right.
and I'm gonna go do work in that reality," right? Like, me d m just losing myself in skepticism, like, that's not constructive, and I care about action and being constructive, so just skip it. It's not worth it. But that leaves, like, a lot of questions and a lot of places of just like, "Oh, how exactly is this whole thing working?" And so I do think you can see like these outlines of the transcendent, of like the outside, that we end up not being able to just access with like pure rationality. Um, and I view that pure rationality itself as more of like machines that you construct for analyzing the things around you and that are not ultimately able to like turn around and then explain reality. It's not. It can't be the beginning of an explanation of reality. I guess is how I think about it.
Mm.
That reality is there, and you're exploring it with rationality to an extent that cannot ever be complete. Does that make sense? I'm trying to word it
Um
properly, but it's quite tricky.
it
Um,
does it does to a degree, but
yeah.
also your views are like very abstract and it's cool. It's cool to hear. I do think it's a little hard to fully understand, but
Yeah.
maybe if I put it my own way, it almost sounds like you like the divine to you is the like chase or the search for it. Um as in like,
Ooh.
yeah, we can't actually land on the idea of it, but rather we can continue to seek it out.
Oh wow. That's I hadn't that never occurred to me to think about it like that, and that I like I love that.
This is
Yeah.
why discussions are awesome because we each
Yeah.
like we hear what one person says, but we like in our brains think of it a different way, and then yeah.
I think another way I could describe it, and this came from me having a really big mental breakdown that was, having hallucinations, like time went out of order, and I spent like a weekend like that. And to try and get out of it, I just started drawing up like a cosmology of this mental state. And I came up with this term, the light cone, in it, which I used the light cone as a term to describe like the world of science, rationality, technology, which is just like the grounded, shared reality. And I thought of it as like I had fallen outside of that. And I was needed to get back into it. I needed time to go in order again.
Yeah.
And so I've continued to use that term that I got from the weekend I went insane to how I think about the divine as just something outside of the light cone and figuring out the theoretically impossible task of like how do we engage with it.
So
Um,
I I know you're pretty non-committal, but ultimately, we're all just searching, I guess, and you're in that boat as well. Um, but do you think, like, because you're using the word divine and stuff like that, so do you
yeah,
actually think there is like a supernatural source of some sort, um or is just because, well, let me just kind of lay down, I guess, briefly where I'm at.
oh,
And uh, I follow similar axioms as you, kind of things I just have to assume
yeah,
just to get past solipsism, and I think most of us do. My first one is the cogito from Descartes. I think, therefore I am. I
yeah,
know that I am at least some sort of existence, because you can't possibly think and not exist at the same time. Even if this is all an
yeah,
illusion, I'm still thinking. So start there, and then I think from there it's safe to just assume the second axiom of, like, we are in a reality, even if it looks
yeah,
different to us, like, we can observe it, test it, measure it certain ways. And so
yeah,
from there, basically, the best way to describe me is not simply an atheist but a naturalist. Because I do believe in, like,
yeah.
objective morality and purpose and things, but I don't really believe
Hmm.
in God. I think it simply can just be an eternal natural process, um and nothing supernatural
Totally.
necessary.
Yeah. Um, I'm curious. You said objective morality, and that is something I was curious about. Do you mean a sort of universal reality or morality? Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, that's interesting to me because partially because I guess of the philosophy endpoint I had found myself at, I didn't see how you could get that really,
Yeah,
like having something truly universal without having God, like a God, to
sure.
be espousing like a universal truth. Um,
And
which you
tread
could talk about, or I could answer the question. Yeah.
Well, I was gonna say tread lightly, because this is absolutely, like, my favorite topic is moral realism and stuff.
Yeah.
So you you might
And
end
I
up
want to
just
hear
get
about
me going.
yeah. But
um
all right, I can answer. Let me answer
yeah, yeah, let's
or
focus on
whatever.
that.
So avoid the rabbit hole and say uh yeah, it's kind of both. I'm trying to figure out how to have both where there
Hmm.
is like the Spinoza reality, which is you know everything that we're measuring with science and then building with technology, and that exists in there's a kabbalistic like Jewish kabbalistic concept of zimzum, which is withdrawal, um, where there's like a recess that God has made,
Sorry, can you spell that
um,
for me? I just want
that
to pull it up.
uh,
Z-
Zimzum
okay.
or Tzimtzum. Um, so within that you have the Spinoza world, and then it is there because of it still is within God. It is the body of God, so to speak. And
Oh, that's
then it
cool.
almost yeah, and it almost like kind of like a weird George Berkeley style like phenomenology where you are you have this like a vehicle God enabling like this perception of reality and engagement with reality because it's all him. So I know other people, it would be less when I want to, if I'm having debates and people keep getting hung up on me using the word God, I will like fall back to using the term monad,
Mm,
which can is more gnostic, and just more it's less spicy, but it is just like the single origin point that expanded out into everything. So
okay.
it is hard. I guess it is by definition supernatural, right? Because the Spinoza world is like the natural world, and that is
Right.
existing within this recess that where there's this withdrawal, and that is how I think about it. I guess like that's the fundamental
So
thrust of it.
this Zimzum idea is actually really
I
cool.
want to.
I've never heard of this
Yeah,
and I love it.
neither had I until I found out about it by finding a weird book.
Yeah. It's like cuz God basically if there is an eternal God who's omni everything, that God would occupy all spaces, like it would occupy all of reality, that like
Mm,
reality would be God. So our creation then sort of comes from God removing itself from that specific space in order for
yeah,
yeah, that's a cool idea. Yeah. I do want to say too though
and
with,
oh, sorry.
with yeah, just with Spinoza, at least how I interpret him, um, it seems like nothing supernatural is necessary. Basically, everything is one substance, right? Even if there is a
Yeah.
sort of immaterial thing, consciousness and whatnot, it still all is just this one substance. And I guess that's where I bring it into naturalism to be like, yeah, we're all just this one part of reality.
Um, I think a funny. This will be an unsatisfying answer, I think, but I'm gonna say it because it's kind of funny too. The way that Eric Goodkind, who wrote this book, would respond to that is just like, of course it's all one substance. God, right? But I know more about what you mean, where it's like, okay, if it's all one substance, we should be able to get at like the rest of God. And it doesn't seem like it, if there's the recess, then there's the rest that is like what you can't get to. And I guess to me, this was, how should I say it? This was something to play with. Like what he concludes is that he makes the argument that monotheism is the most scientific belief system, which you can agree or disagree with. But his purpose behind it being specifically monotheism is that it is the simplest and therefore the most correct way of looking at the Simpson. And then the other book I found, which was just a lot wilder, was this one, Coalescence by Tao Palamas, which is also just a really crazy looking book, that tied it back into. Uh, I ended up merging with the Eric Goodkin and being just like, okay, well, so it's monotheism, but it's still kind of we're making guesses about the transcendent, so why not have like a lot of fun with it?
Yeah.
And with that, I pulled back into I just started taking things from everywhere and building up a more chaotic metaphysics of what like this whole outside is. Um, towards the end of man, okay, I'm trying to think of how to tie this all together here. The with the idea of playful religion of just like ways of rationalizing and making meaning for things around us with the focus of making things be constructive and like therapeutic and actionable. So to speak about Gnosticism, one of the core beliefs of it is in fact that like the material world is just like a prison made by a um like an evil demiurge,
Mm.
and it doesn't matter, we have to get beyond it, we have to stop like preoccupation with like the physical world, which is just suffering. And so I don't like that for the same reason that I don't like solipsism, because I don't I don't think it is good to have like these tenets of your faith that kind of like promote a lack of action or like an irrelevance of like action you could be doing. Like that feels like it collapses kind of into nihilism if you try and get practical with it. So, like by that example, so it's just like, okay, forget it, forget that part of Gnosticism. Um, and
Can
that's
you
kind of what I
explain
mean
what
by
a
grateful religion. Yeah.
sorry, I know the
Oh, sorry.
delay's bad. But can you
Yeah,
just
you
explain
sent
what a
me something here.
Oh yeah, that's for later. Yeah, we don't need to open that rabbit hole yet.
Oh,
Just in case we get to moral realism, I sent you all of
oh,
my
I see.
definitions for the theory. So, um
You have had this conversation before. I see.
oh,
We've
I've
discussed
thought
moral
a
realism before.
lot about moral realism. I spend a lot
Yeah.
of my brain
Oh, okay.
energy thinking about that.
Yeah.
And just so you
No, it
know,
makes
if in
yeah.
case we don't get to talking about it, I'm very careful to tell people that I just believe in moral realism. Something like the theory of evolution, I accept as like a working theory,
Yeah.
whereas moral realism theory is just something I believe and I think there's justification for it. So, um, anyway, to go back,
I guess,
can
yeah. To use the terms you just used really quickly, I would say that um the what I got like metaphysically and philosophically from the absolute collective is that I feel like I can get away with religion. That's the
hmm,
term I would use. So I started playing.
okay. Um, can you just explain to us what a demiurge is? What that means?
Sure. So this is Gnostic territory where so you have the original mm, more or less monadic god, Sophia, and by monad I mean like point of origin, that like
Mm,
everything comes out of the like the first thing, that god, except for maybe water. Some in a lot of origin stories, water is there and then God shows up. And that leaves me
hmm,
with a lot of questions, but I don't have time for that. I don't
yeah.
think, or I don't know enough about it. And so uh, that origin, Sophia created another being, um, who is the demiurge, and his name, uh, he's got a long name, but the name basically translates to "Hey, come over here," because she was like, "Hey, come over here, let's talk," and he was like, "Oh, that's my name," and then he just immediately went on a rampage like a sort of misbehaving kid, and while misbehaving, created physical reality, and it's just a whole lot of suffering for everyone, right? And it's something that we need to transcend and escape. Is how the like stereotypical Gnostic, maybe specifically, I'm trying to remember the word, like Manichaean Gnostic way of viewing reality. I also became kind of, I guess, a religion nerd of sorts. So I have. It hasn't been a while, but I've just been reading and learning a lot about it. So I try
So
and keep on. Oh
I
yeah, Manichaean and Mandaean Gnosticism, I think, is the one that specifically finds itself opposed to physical reality in that sense.
so this this demiurge that you're talking about, because when I did my brief, basically I read the Gnosticism Wikipedia and listened to
Yeah,
like a video. That's my extent of Gnosticism. I haven't read any books or anything. Um, but one of the cooler things that I really liked about it is from the sounds of it, it seems like there is this like creator God but there's also another entity that broke off and created our world specifically
Yeah,
and is not
that's the
necessarily
demiurge.
the
Yeah.
yeah. And which I think it's a cool idea because you think of a god like Yahweh, who is the god of the Abrahamic religions. In the Old Testament,
Mhm.
this god is wrathful, vengeful,
Yeah.
jealous, angry, and so it kind of makes sense that this is the kind of evil god, I guess, in some way that broke
Yeah.
away from the real creator god.
Yeah. I read a book. I got into the habit of just like skimming through academic theology books. Like, I just want to see like what are people doing in theology departments, and looked at the books that were coming out because this is the sort of thing I do for fun. And I found an amazing book that I really loved called "A Transparent Illusion," which talks about like a this one like episode in Judaism where four people make it to okay, there's the seven heavens, and so four guys make it to the fourth one. And then three of them get flicked off. They mess it up all at the last moment. And then one guy gets in, and he got in because he like knew a guy or something like that. But if the book focuses on one of the people and went into seventh heaven and or sixth heaven and said the word water. Just said looked around and was like water. And God was like, "Not here, you don't. Like, absolutely not." And then shot like a million swords at him and sent him to hell. And so the book is just about like, what are we even supposed to learn from this? And which is an excellent question. Um, and but it just goes through all of the different possible interpretations of like why exactly did God get mad at this?
Yeah.
And it ended up having a good explanation at the end, if people want me to spoil the ending, but I do think there's, like, the better point of just, like, you have this thing that, like, around that nobody knows the answer for. Like, you have this episode of just God Yahweh, I should say, being, like, a dick, and someone who's, like, pious enough to make it that far. Like, that's not nobody. That's not just Joe Sixpack. That's the guy who made it to sixth heaven. And you just said the word water, and you sent him to eternal suffering. It's like, and you don't know why. You don't know why that was bad. And so it is like the Yahweh God leaves a lot to be desired.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah,
or
that's
it's
true.
just scary. It's like, what is it? How do you react to this being the creator? Like, what are you supposed to do?
Well, and that's the origin of a lot of atheists is
Yeah,
reading about their supposed loving God and being like, this isn't adding up for me. This doesn't
yeah,
feel like love to me. And
yeah.
so yeah, I mean there's that old joke that's like the best book to the atheist manual of creating an atheist is the Bible. So just read the full
Yeah,
Bible and you'll probably become an atheist. But
for real. Yeah. Like I I agree with that. Um I agree with that all of it and that's why when I was starting to get back into Christianity just I also should say the reason I'm taking like a Christian angle with it is because I randomly decided it just so I don't know. Maybe like I've been vegan for 8 years, and the
mm,
reason I went vegan originally was just because I wanted more rules,
you
right?
wanted more
Like I
what?
just do that sometimes. Rules, like
Rules. Okay.
rules I had to obey, like
Uh,
conduct in my own life,
okay.
and I stuck with it. So at one point, I randomly decided, like, nope, it's Christianity, and so it's like, yeah, I'm gonna keep going down that. But then I decided, being the person I am, I wanted it to be. It's just like oh, this is canon. Like this is all the books I'm supposed to read. I'm gonna go read everything but those, um,
Mm.
because I love heresy, and I think the process of like making heresy and engaging with heresy is the really important thing.
Well, and the
Though
early
there's a whole
Gnostics,
conversation. Yo, yeah,
they were
uh,
like executed and stuff, right? Like they were all heretics
yeah,
according to the Catholic Church. You know what? You would actually
Yeah,
probably be interested, and maybe you already have it, but have you heard of the Sefer? It's like
the separate.
CEPHAR, I
I
think.
know, like Sefer
Oh, ER.
Razio. Like I know Sefer is like book, right? So there are a
Uh,
number of Sephers, I think,
there's
but I think
like
Sefer Raziel is like.
there's specifically a Bible that's called Sefer, and it
Mm.
includes all of the books that the early Christians took out of the canon. So it has
Ooh.
all, like, yeah, because they made the canon back in the day,
Oh.
right? And they kicked out all these different books. So
Yo,
that's
how
probably
did I
something you
not know
like.
about this? While I was looking for something like the thing you just showed me, this was one of the best ones I found that was called like the Other Bible. That's just like a big pile
Mm,
of the Apocrypha and heresy. Um, but yeah, it's a good point because like I see that there's a canon, and my reaction being the person I am is just like, uh, why? Like, what don't you want
yeah.
me to read?
Yeah, and that's
And then I'm more
exactly,
motivated to go read that than the
this is
canon.
like where my skepticism always comes in to anyone being
Yeah,
dogmatic, even if it's science, like to say that this
yeah,
must be the way to follow. And like dogmatism to me is like the greatest evil we have. And canon is the same thing. It's like, oh, these are the only books you can read. I think that you would,
mm,
so in my little moral system, I actually think veganism is the morally superior position. So congrats to you on that one. Um
yeah.
um
Thank you.
yeah, and that's a
Um,
long time to
yeah,
go
sure,
too.
I'll take it. Yeah, yeah. It was weird. I just did it, and I liked having the extra rules so much that it's been one of the only things I can think of that I have done like so unquestioningly for that
Mm,
long a time. Maybe the only thing.
yeah.
Um, because I don't know, it just slotted right into my brain when I started doing it. So go figure.
Yeah. So
Um,
I had
but
a
I want to
question.
say,
Oh, go ahead and
oh,
finish.
as a to do devil's something's advocate, devil's advocate. Yeah. I do think quite a lot about heresy versus orthodoxy because I was in a context where um when trying to talk about religion with people on the internet in the context I was existing in, it was like 99% like Orthodox people, like people who would specify I am Orthodox, then something, Orthodox Catholic, or just Orthodox in some sense. And then my buddies, the people on my team, which were two schizophrenic people that I would engage with and enjoy talking with them a lot because I was like, okay, I feel like we make sense to each other. And then like the Orthodox people feel like kind of aliens. And just the way my brain works, I know that I would not be able to do an Orthodox religion or genuinely ever believe in it. Because if someone just tells me something and I'm supposed to believe it, then I can't. Like it's impossible. However, there was like I read a really interesting book called The Two Antichrists that was about L. Ron Hubbard, the founder of Scientology, and Jack Parsons, who was a very important like rocket engineer. And so they were both involved in Thelema, which is Aleister Crowley's religion in the 1950s. And so it was just talking about their interactions with each other, which is a really strange, kind of jarring to think about overlap of personalities. And there's a moment in the book towards the end where it contrasts Thelema versus Scientology. And it says, like, well, the reason that there's so many more Scientologists than Thelemites is because Scientology is like the ultimate orthodoxy. and so it like sucks people into it.
Mm.
Where thelema is in its way largely about heresy and like making your own meanings about things. Um, Apparently, I don't know a ton about it. This is what the book said, and as such, people couldn't engage with it as well, and that confused me because I felt like I myself am the opposite, but I don't know if people at large are the opposite. So I guess if there was an argument to be made for orthodoxy, it would be for someone who thinks just like th- if you are of the belief, which I am not and don't want to be, that people in general need to be corralled in a healthy direction, I think that's where orthodoxy comes from. But I don't know. I really don't know.
Yeah. Huh. Well,
But
um I had a question written out for you kind of about different gods and entities like Krishna, Yahweh, etc. All like gods of paganism, Freya, stuff like that. And um well, okay. So number one, the original question, I just wanted to see what you thought about these entities that people believe in. If you think it's simply just mythology and attempting to explain that source, or if you do think that maybe they're actual manifestations of the source and people are just interpreting it in a different way. So not to overwhelm you, but that's number one.
no.
And then number two, I'm curious why specifically Jesus is the entity that you choose to focus on rather than any of these other options.
Hold on. I was just jotting that down for myself. So the first one for different gods, it's funny. Uh, so to step back for 1 second, that will make this response easier for me. Um, I did start to engage. I took in a lot of spiritist practice because it felt like a very good font of creativity. And by that, I mean like focusing on like there being a spirit that is connected to the divine, which is something that falls out of the idea of Zimzum. Um,
Mm.
so you have some connection to like a spirit world and can engage with that however you end up engaging with it. And then a way that a lot of people engage with it is that they feel that there are different entities in there. So if you ever feel like um you're listening to something or something is talking with you or you are talking back with it in whatever phenomenological way that that happens, then a lot of people will parse it as like that is me having communication with my god or my deity of choice.
Yeah.
um though me and one of my friends, I was excited that someone else was also thinking this way, so that it's like, oh, but that leaves the possibility of like you think you're talking with god, but it's someone pretending to be God. It's some like spirit out there that is acting like God. It's like, yeah, of course I'm Yahweh, you know.
Yeah.
Um, and I do think that this has like, if you wanted to bring that back to reality, I think a lot of this has equivalents there, which is like going to like a mega church or like following Joel Osteen is just like that could be a good example of the Antichrist, I think, right? If
Yeah.
you have like this sort of religious fervor and then it
Right.
ends up being negated rather than like being used to a healthy purpose. So it is just like, oh, sure, you're talking to like Yahweh or Krishna. I don't know a ton about how other deities work, or so you could be talking with anything, and that anything may be good and constructive in helping humanity, or it may be bad, no matter who it is, right? It is ultimately has, I guess this is very postmodern to get to like step, I can't help it. It's who I am at heart. But when you're talking with God, like, I kind of wanted the word God to have the same inherent relative nature as like when you say mom, right? Like when you say mom, people know you're talking about your mom, where when you say God, you're inherently talking about your own relationship to this thing, this ineffable thing, or many things, or like con artist thing that lives in some corner of your mind.
Hmm.
And then for Jesus, I don't think that much about Jesus. I am like the worst. I I think I say Christian because that's maybe it's just a troll in some sense,
Hmm.
but I do use like a lot of Christian imagery to like explain things or like make little parallels, I guess. I have a very warped microwave version of Christianity, though I
Okay.
do think Jesus is a adds like a really fascinating flavor to div- like thinking about your religion because of how like um brutal it is, right? Like your whole thing being just like your symbol is hanging like a corpse around and you're thinking about like the scraps of like a dying body, and that is the core, this is like a very blood and bones core of your faith, like focusing on blood and the transmutation of blood into wine, and blood at times being the medium through which like the spirit connects to the body for some people is very interesting to me.
Wow. So
It's
the
really metal. Yeah.
that's super interesting because you always expect someone who's like, oh yeah, like I believe in Jesus, or like I've even heard atheists, so like quote unquote atheist Christians, which doesn't really make sense, but
Yeah.
they say it because it's basically like Jesus as the ultimate humanist. The idea of Jesus that some of us were taught was just the ultimate human being, you know, carrying after the downtrodden, all that type of stuff, accepting the
Oh, yeah.
horrors. And so that's a very interesting that the reason
Yeah.
you
I
are
think
attached to it is because of the blood magic, basically. That's super interesting.
I mean, the reason I'm attached to it is because I randomly decided to be attached to it, but that
Mm.
is like where my mind goes when I think about engaging with it. I guess because I was reading hold on. I learned about the strangest sect of
uh
Christianity I've ever heard of, which is saying something called Martinism. And this started with the translator's introduction that was talking about how so the strangest thing about Martinism is that it was like a very heretical form of Christianity that harbored like a secret society that was very influenced by masonry. And
mhm.
they were it was like a training program for elite exorcists. And apparently it is commonly regarded as, or people would talk about it as like a blood cult was the term the translator used. And
Right.
he was defending how it wasn't a blood cult, and so that has been on my mind.
Well, it's interesting because I don't think a lot of Christians realize how much their religion revolves around these blood magic ritual. Well, and if magic is an
Yeah.
offensive term, I don't mean it to be offensive to
Oh,
just call something magic, but
uh,
uh yeah,
no.
but they don't, I
None
don't think
taken.
they
Like I said,
realize.
oh, I was gonna say I was gonna use the term occult Christian for myself, so I am not offended by you using the term magic.
Because a
It
cult is
is there
pretty
is a
like
lot of magic.
magic. Right, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. Yeah, but I don't think
Um,
they realize because you know, literally we have a curse on our on our genes because of Adam and Eve. Ever since the fall, humans have a curse, and we needed a blood
Yeah.
sacrifice of a perfect human
Yeah.
to magically lift the curse. Like, it's pretty wild.
Have you ever seen the movie Mother by Darren Aronofsky?
I haven't.
Um, I I like that movie because I feel like that's a fun movie to go in knowing as little as possible about. Um, but what I will say is that it is the most intense movie I've ever seen, and I'm a person who seeks out intensity in art. Um, and it certainly has a moment that really made me think about the death of Christ in the most visceral way I ever
Mm,
have. Yeah, so if you want like an experiential blast of like the horror of reality and oh, I have actually a book upstairs that I need to read by Wilhelm Reich, who is the psychologist who came up with the idea of orgone energy, which is just some like life force energy that you sit in a box, or you can build a box that like focuses like this basic like sexual life energy. But he has a book, I don't know a
mm,
ton about it, called The Murder of Christ that I got because it's like, wow, that looks really hardcore. I'm curious what this is. That focuses on like what does it mean that we had the perfect human around and then we 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 just goddamn killed him. We couldn't
mm.
stand him. We just murdered the
Yeah.
guy. And that seems like that bodes pretty poorly for humanity. Um,
Yeah. True.
all right. So yeah, I also don't like the idea of original sin. It's because that also feels like for a similar reason, like I don't know what you gain out of viewing yourself as like inherently fallen.
Yeah.
Um, for like no reason for something you didn't even do, right? It's just like, great, I'm born, I'm already cursed. And
Yeah.
so to answer your question, that was maybe the first question you asked me, which was about salvation. Um, I do think salvation is much more like how do we stop our world from being horrible
Mm.
than it is about like how do I get into heaven. That's like the thing that I care
It's like
about
saving
more.
the actual world, not making
Yeah,
it to
because I think
some
that that
kingdom.
is yeah, yeah, because that is what like uh Eric Goodkind here phrased it in a way I really liked that it's just like this is Eden. It's still Eden, but how do we get back to Eden, right? How
How
do
do
we
we
make the
get
world
back
like
to
a
flowing
healthier
rivers?
place?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, I'm
and
glad
that seemed
you
constructive and good. So
sorry. I'm glad you mentioned that you don't like the idea of original sin because to me that's actually one of the most harmful things that comes out
yeah,
of Abrahamic religions. Um, because
mhm,
yeah, I mean, I can attest to it as a child. I felt broken, and obviously there's a process. You're supposed to repent and all this stuff. But yeah, just teaching children that they are inherently broken and need an outside source to save them from that. I think it's very harmful.
yeah, yes, yeah. It feels like uh, perhaps like actually like gaslighting, right? Like
Yeah,
abuse,
right.
in some sense, right? Like if you're just like you are at very least like really imprinting something on a developing mind.
Yep.
Um, and Catholicism can be held to that too, which is like I do have like a study group of friends who are also doing this weird religious thing where we are just being really playful with it. And so one thing that I helped that has ended up helping me kind of remarkably a lot in making my mental state healthier, like recovering after like this big low point in my life
Yeah.
was this idea of like spiritual combat or unseen warfare, which is funny is a goofy term, but it really clicked with me, which was this idea of viewing like these negative thoughts, like these intrusive thoughts about like depression or violence or anxiety as like literally like attacking spirits that you need to just like knock away, like hit them with your sword or what have you. And just that as a basic concept was very easy to fit into my brain, which is like I'm at spiritual combat,
Yeah.
as opposed to other processes I've done therapeutically, like DBT,
Yeah.
where it's just like, oh, I'm feeling anxious. I need to remember, my headspace, or oh, I need to grab my index cards that I wrote all my coping mechanisms on. It's like,
Can I
no, I got a
just
sword and I gotta
say,
like cut them up.
like,
Yeah,
this right here is actually somewhere where I align very closely with you. I love the idea of thinking about my own mental issues as metaphorical
yeah,
demons, because it's like,
yeah,
yeah, it's
yeah,
it's like a way to go through it in your mind to how can I expel these demons out of me, even though I literally don't believe they're actual demons at all. But it does, it helps
yeah.
you like kind of move past that and remove the demons, you know?
Yeah, and actually build the habit of removing them because it's
Yes,
so like easy
exactly.
to wallow, or like building habits can be quite hard. So just having it just like I'm fighting is so easy to bring up.
Yeah.
And so this is like a way of thinking that was really adopted by Eastern Orthodox. And so I was reading a bit more about it. It has the terms like logosmoi and nos, but whatever. When I was reading into it, it was talking about the seven deadly sins,
Yeah.
and the reason it considered those to be seven deadly sins in Eastern Orthodox was because those are ways of thinking that are especially like intrusive and attacking and can
Yeah.
like really take over your way of thinking, right? Just like lust and envy and wrath. It's so easy for me to get caught up in anger. And when I read that, I was like, whoa, that's why they're the seven deadly sins?
Yeah.
Where, because being raised Catholic, my understanding that I had of those seven deadly sins were just like, oh, God really hates those. And so, like, to compare and contrast those two, like, at least the way that this one wiki page presented Eastern Orthodox of thinking about them is that like, oh, that's actually like therapeutic. Like that could help you, you know,
Yeah.
get better control over your mind state, your brain weather. Where the Catholic one is just like more shame,
Right.
and it's like
God hates
totally
this.
unconstructive.
Yeah, and
Yeah, it's
that's
just
this is another area like
yeah,
again, I love the idea of the seven deadly sins because it's not because I'm worried that God hates them and I'm going to go to hell for
right.
being lustful or whatever it is, but because I have noticed in my personal life things like gluttony
Yeah,
making my life shitty, like a living hell. And
yeah,
I feel much
yeah,
better when I'm not letting these addictive things and thoughts control my life. And so, yeah, it's
yeah. And yeah, after a really bad breakup, I had a lot of wrath that I like couldn't figure that I just was like, "Oh my god, I how do I stop thinking about this?" Like my brain just keeps going to this over and over and over again. And then it only finally found myself getting away from it when I started thinking in this way. And so, hey, if nothing else, that made a lot of difference.
yeah,
Um, and that was one of the reasons I was originally trying to like engage with religion too, was after reading a bit of Jung, thinking about religion as maybe like a good way to engage with my subconscious. And then also from the Playful Religion book, it does talk about neurology, or like cognitive science, and like the nature of consciousness, and suggesting in a way that I found compelling that like the dual hemispheres, like the left and right side of the brain, that the side that is engaged with like myth making or like general narratives and finding meaning are is like under engaged. And that's may or may I'm sure people could have like endless scientific debates over whether that is actually true, but I at least found it compelling enough that I wanted to try messing with it. And once this other book with Eric Goodkind gave me like metaphysical permission to mess with it, I found myself able to. I felt like I'd hacked my brain into like, oh, I kind of believe in God now, so I can
Mhm.
explore this. This is another tool I can use to like play with my mental state.
Yeah.
So it is kind of like sober psychonautics in a
Mhm.
sense, and I'm using like religious beliefs into myth making to like play
As like
with
a
my mind and
psychology
see.
thing, like it's yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And this is,
therapy. Yeah,
I really appreciate this conversation because I don't think I realized until now why I'm so drawn to religious texts, even though I'm an atheist and don't believe in them.
yeah.
I think there's a reason they were useful to the evolution of
Yeah.
humanity and society, because there are little
Mhm.
nuggets of good ideas in there. And so it's almost like am taking a secular approach to these religious texts, and like you're saying, using them in a psychology way. um and I'm sorry to kind of cut this part short, but I do feel like I have
Sure.
to guide this a little down the path, because we have gone over an hour now. um
Okay. Yeah.
and again, I appreciate you being here. I do just want to say,
Sure.
anyone listening out there, um I and you as well. You said you had some friends that you like to do study groups and stuff with. Like, my biggest goal here is to build this Discord community. Like, more than anything, I just want a big community of people who like severely disagree, or I mean minorly disagree,
Yeah.
and we can just come here and hash it out. And so, like, please invite your friends or anyone
I
you know. So yeah, and anyone
I
out
love
there,
talking with people I disagree with
yeah, same.
more than people I agree with
That's
all the time. Yeah.
exactly. I hesitate bringing atheists on because I'm like, what are we going to talk about? Yeah, like I don't want to sit here
Yeah.
and be an echo chamber. Like, yeah. So anyway, anyone listening, just remember that, like, more than anything, I just want to grow this community. So, moving forward, the choice is yours. Red pill or blue pill. We can either wrap it up, call it a day, or I'll let you take the opportunity to ask me questions or challenge me, push me on anything, whatever might interest you in that regard.
Um. Uh. I feel like the thing I want to know the most about is just I want to hear more about the experience growing up Mormon because I
Okay.
don't know. I haven't. I knew like some Jehovah's Witnesses growing up. I don't know if that's comparable at all, or I just did not grow up around Mormons and
Yeah.
didn't encounter many in my life. But this might also be something you've talked about already endlessly. Uh,
Um, I haven't talked a whole lot about it. I did like a two-part episode where I kind of gave a life monologue and kind of gave my background and upbringing and stuff like that. But honestly, yeah, I don't feel like people ask me about it that much. So, yeah, I haven't talked about
because
it.
yeah, one thing I do love hearing about, like I also just find religion in and of itself extremely interesting.
Yeah,
Um,
me too.
so I enjoy hearing people talk about it because you're an ex-Mormon and an atheist now, so it didn't work for you,
Yeah.
clearly. Um,
Yes.
and so it's just curious, like I do feel like I have this. It's a term that feels so cynical to use, uh, religious engineering almost. It's just like I want to try and put together like what's a really healthy religion. It's like I feel like I have like hacked my brain into believing in God, so I want to play with it, which I don't know how many people are in that same position. It is
Hmm.
not it is at least something I have never heard another person say. Um so it's fun and it's interesting to me.
Well, it's interesting to ask what a healthy religion would be because I think every religion out there has the
Yeah.
opportunity of being healthy. I mean,
Yeah.
even in the Middle East where Sharia law is implemented, like, they don't drink, they like raise their families.
True.
Like, so depending on what you're meaning by like healthy and whatnot, I any of them can be good
Yeah.
or bad for someone's health. Um,
That's
and
a
it
good
is
point. Yeah.
interesting. It's interesting to see like which ones fail and which one like you said, like obviously it didn't work for me, and it's like why does it fail for some people and why does it succeed massively for some people? And they
Yeah.
obviously super religious people are going to say, well, because you just wanted a life of sin and blah 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 blah, and it's just like
Yeah.
did I
Hey, who
really?
doesn't? Everyone wants a life of sin, right?
Well, and what's
Um,
interesting for
so what do
me
you do?
is
Yeah.
like that might have somewhat started out when I was like in junior high. I stopped going to church because I was just like, fuck this. I want to rebel against everything. Blah. So originally that
Yeah.
might be true, but now it's like it's the farthest thing from true because I am actively working to better myself and not be
Yeah.
gluttonous and lustful and wrathful. Like I am
Yeah.
as an atheist can like I don't want to live in quote sin even though I think sin's
Yeah.
just a dumb thing, but yeah, it's
Yeah. Sin feels outdated,
yeah.
right? Or it's just like the there is some good idea there around like to follow the notion of like the seven deadly sins with like Eastern Orthodox. It does feel like that is there can be a healthy idea of that that is just not what people I see people using, right?
Yeah. So what specifically about Mormonism? Like, do you just want a general idea of what
I
they
don't know.
believe or kind of like how they're raised?
Um well, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the dog barking.
I
Um
can't actually.
okay, good, good. Uh I have a general notion of like the origins of Mormonism and then like the movement out to Utah. I have some historical idea. I'm curious just about like I guess the experience of growing up in it to
Okay. Yeah.
the extent that it is because I do have some mental image of like m- an almost idyllic mental image of Mormonism that I really don't think is correct. Um, of just like maybe like what you were talking about with Sharia law, just like very important like family dynamics
Yeah.
and like
And no drinking.
positivity.
Yeah,
Yeah, potentially healthy, but I don't know how true that is. Yeah.
it's actually pretty interesting. Like there's certain elements that really are similar to Islam in the sense of like the early Mormons and the fundamentals now had more than one wife, and in Islam you can have up to four wives. Drinking is
Yeah.
prohibited in both Islam and Mormonism. Patriarchy and family values is, well, that's pretty key to all Abrahamic religions, but it is interesting to see the similarities there. And I actually think you would probably enjoy the theology of Mormonism. I don't know if
Yeah.
you've read the Book of Mormon, but you should because
No, I
it's
need to
pretty
get it. Yeah,
interesting.
I agree.
Um, and to be
Oh,
fair, yeah, what's up?
oh, as a quick thing to just add, yeah, another reason I'm interested that I just brought to mind is that Mormonism feels like one of two like actually new religions that is like successful. Like the other one I can think of is uh wow, I suddenly can't remember this the name of the Sikh. Yeah, like the Sikh religion, I think is also
Mm,
fairly new. And my mental
yeah.
image of Sikh people was just like they're killing it,
Yeah. Um,
basically.
well, so I like want to tell you so much about it because you like, okay, first off, I think that the theology of Mormonism is actually way more just and fair than your other classical Abrahamic religions who say, like, follow God, believe in Jesus, or go to hell. And, like, that's it, basically.
Yeah,
Whereas Mormonism, there are three kingdoms of heaven. Even if you are the worst and don't accept Jesus and you live in sin, you still afterward go to the lowest kingdom of heaven, which is massively better than earth. So it's like a way more compassionate punishment. It's like, yeah, you didn't make it to the
yeah,
top kingdom, but you still get a better life. Like it actually feels like a loving God somewhat. So there's that.
yeah,
And then the growing up aspect, you know, when I was younger and I was first in Salt Lake, which is a very much, obviously bigger cities are always much more tolerant and accepting of people and than like kind of rural areas. Um so honestly, the ward I was in, the community, like that's what I loved the most about it. I genuinely felt like
yeah.
the community had my back. They loved me. Like, I had leaders that cared about me and took me on outings and all this type of stuff. So it was
Cool.
in that way actually a good experience. I then later moved to a more rural area of the state, and that ward was just night and day. I felt much more shame. And I was also becoming a teenager. So, you're going
Yeah,
through different things then. But I felt like this bubble of judgment and I hated it. I absolutely hated it. And that started,
yeah,
what ultimately tipped it for me was the only tool I was taught to use when I'm suffering in pain and crying because I'm depressed and ashamed of myself, the only tool I was taught was to get on your knees and pray, ask for help and guidance from your heavenly Father. And so what really tipped it for
yeah,
me was me being on my knees bawling, like, help me,
yeah,
and never receiving answers. And so that's where the Mormon teachings failed
yeah.
me as a kid.
Yeah, that sounds like slack that is supposed to be picked up by the community or something,
Mhm.
right? Because that was what I was thinking about with, like, I feel like an ideal or a better religion which should be like a toolkit of like how to help you when you're like, I don't know, down in that way. I
Yeah,
get it. I very much
yeah.
get it, and it is what all. Yeah,
Well, and one more part I wanted to tell you about that I actually think you would find very fascinating. And another reason you need to
sure.
read the Book of Mormon. And by the way, you need to read the whole combo. There's the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, and Pearl of Great Price. So make sure it has all three, because in the Doctrine and Covenants it talks a lot about the early Mormons in the US. And what's fascinating to me is they were essentially communists. They literally moved out to their own areas, started local compounds, and there's
Cute.
in the doctrine it says we will run the storehouse. Everyone will give their share to the storehouse. Everyone will be fed an equal amount. They're literally communists. It's pretty cool.
And but like progressive communists too, because I remember, or in some sense at least, where like one thing that I did look into because I found it fascinating was the Deseret language, and that did feel like that was at least trying to be this cognitive advancement of like, oh, this will help everyone learn and be more functional. It'll like empower people, which is cool, at least in intention.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they were progressive in the sense of religious freedom. They,
Yeah.
no one was super progressive
Yeah,
back
I
then, right? Everyone still hated
yes.
like natives and blacks, and like it was all bad.
Uh,
but but they were
uh,
progressive in the sense of like the US is supposed to be religious freedom. Like what are these Puritans they were getting killed. They tarred and feathered and shit. They were getting persecuted everywhere they went.
Sorry, I got distracted because I went to
That's okay.
look up the Book of Mormon, and this is a cheap book. This pleases me. This I can get it in hardcover for $4, and that's what I like to hear. Um,
Of the Book of Mormon?
so I was just
Oh,
like taken aback, yeah,
dude, just
of
invite
how.
invite a missionary over. They'll give you one for free.
Oh, yo, and I would love to talk to a missionary, probably, right?
Yeah.
Like I feel like this, like a pervert of some sort, where it's just like, oh, I'm like the freakiest like Christian I can imagine. um, and now I get to, I don't know, talk about like John D and angelic magic with like a Mormon missionary. Um,
Oh, I I don't know why that I randomly like got excited to talk about this, but you kind of mentioned Jehovah's Witnesses earlier. And so
oh,
this
sure.
a super interesting thing about both of these religions and Jesus in general is there are different versions of Jesus. So you have the Trinity, right? That's
Yeah.
kind of like the classical version, the triune God. And Mormons, in their theology, it still is a trinity, but they are literally three separate beings. Rather than like one being with three separate persons, they are three individual beings: the Holy Ghost, the Son, and the Father. In fact, Joseph Smith supposedly was
Ooh.
visited by the Son and the Father, like two separate individuals. And then the Jehovah's Witness version I just recently learned of Jesus is that it actually was Archangel Michael who was sent as an angel
Whoa!
into the flesh of Jesus. And yeah, so it's pretty cool.
Damn. Okay. Yeah. Well, I do think it's the Trinity is fascinating because you get that was the whole major split between like Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox was like what the relationship precisely is between the Father and the Holy Spirit, right? Which is fascinating to me. Um, oh, and the thing that caused like canonization in the first place with like the Nicene Creed was because people got so worked up in Rome about like the idea that some guy like some preacher was like, "Hey, if we have a father and a son, then the father, in order to be a father, brings the son into existence. So there's a little bit of time. There's got to be a period of time where there isn't both a father and a son." And
Yeah.
that made it,
Yeah.
everyone got so worked up about that that Rome stopped. So Caesar was like, you need to figure your shit out and figure out a doctrinal answer to that so people go back to their jobs. So to them to be three different people, I want to hear about what the Holy Spirit's like. The other two I can imagine. I want to learn about like an independent Holy Spirit. So I guess I got to read this.
Yeah. Well, and just like the Bible, a lot of the Book of Mormon, the ancient stories are a bit tough, like kind of boring and like, this happened like, oh, they went to
Yeah.
war again and they came back, they believed in God again, like, that same old. It's kind of a similar story as the Jews of the Old Testament. Do you know that the Book of Mormon took place in South America? Basically, like the Native Americans were supposedly the ones who wrote the golden plates down and whatnot.
I knew I guess I didn't know it was South America. I knew it was in the New World, so to speak, I
Yeah.
guess.
And
But
maybe it was Central and North. Yeah, it could have been just the Americas in general.
yeah, and I feel like I know a bunch of other random bits that I'm trying to remember, and I'm just looking at the different scriptures, and there is the one that has Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, Pearl of Great Price, and the Holy Bible itself. Um,
Oh, it's the quad. You found the
it's
quad.
and speaking of, yeah, the different canonizations that exist are also really interesting to me. The that it varies, and then there's like some Ethiopian church that is just like has like canonized way more than everyone else in a way that seems exciting and fun. Like constantly adding new.
Yeah.
I guess it's not new. That's probably old. Oh well, I think I'm getting
Well,
talked out a little bit.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
kind of it.
We can wrap it up here because yeah, I am feeling a little similar. But if you already have the King
Sure.
James Bible, I would suggest getting
Oh,
just
I
the.
don't. I haven't read the Bible
You haven't read the
because,
Bible?
and at this point, nope. I've read bits of it. At this point, it's one of those things that I'm also like. It's really funny to me that I haven't read the Bible. I probably should.
So you want to keep
I
that
know, I
troll?
know, I know the gist of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I got too distracted reading like really deep cut heresy, like Thunder Perfect Mind and Treatise on the Eighth and Ninth and stuff like that. So I kind of just skip my way through the Bible.
Oh, that's pretty funny.
Um,
I feel like you have to keep it up now just for the sense of
right?
trolling.
Yeah. It's like who needs the Bible? I've got like a pile of heretical creation stories next to me that I can work with. um, but
Well,
yeah, I've read like Sermon on the Mount, some of the bigger ones there, but
yeah.
not it in its entirety at all.
Well, yeah, I feel like I just hit that brain fry wall that you were just talking about. Uh, in
Yeah.
fact, I think this is the longest discussion I've had so far. So it's been
Oh,
really
dang.
fun,
Yeah.
and thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah,
I
thank you for doing this. I do
yeah.
I like I had been seeking more people to just talk with religion about because I just find it such an interesting topic that I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, and please share stuff in the Discord. Like, I will, for the most part, I will always respond to anyone who's sending things in the Discord. Um, we're slowly building it, it's getting bigger, and slowly more people are actually adding things and not just me the whole time talking. So, um,
Sure.
yeah, again, like if you have friends who you know would love to come and engage, even just like with you, and I can add stuff. Um, and on top of that, I really would like to have another episode with you about strictly society and politics and kind of progressing and
Sure.
best ways to do that.
Yeah. The way I'd summarize it is like for me, I've been trying to I feel like my politics have been trying to figure out anything that's not nihilism as a big
Yeah.
constantly evolving project that is currently taken this form. This is what I've been reduced to is uh religious engineering that I think I still see and like the occult in general I still see I can convince myself of the possibility of potential. But yes, yeah, yeah.
Cool. Well, any last words, anything else before we close it off?
Just that I'm thinking of some weird stuff I can put into the religion chat because I have a lot of
Yeah,
weird
please.
religious fragments.
Please
So,
do. Oh, and yeah, last thing real quick. I don't know if you care about social media or anything that you're doing, but I'll gladly put any links in the description if you want me to.
ah, nah, I left all of social media basically because I don't know, it bummed me out a lot.
Mm-hmm.
So
I
just
get that.
took a break and I don't regret it really.
Well, I'm excited to have you around in the Discord, and I think
Me too. Yeah.
I'm talking to a Christian not next Sunday but the following, and um I
Yeah.
actually really enjoy when people come around and get in the audience, because towards the end I'll actually bring people up to ask the guest questions and stuff. So if you're ever around and you
Sure.
see the stages going, yeah, come hop in.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of fun. I'd be down to do that for sure. Because having a place where I can hear more people talk about it will also just be interesting to me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. All right. Appreciate you coming. It's been great.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. You too. Um,
All right.
and then have a good rest of your night there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you take care.